our conference, Learning from the Past, Engaging for the Future. My name is Konrad Kramer. I'm the foreign editor of Austrian national daily newspaper Kurier. Well, personally, I've been writing a book recently about, which is called New Borders, Unpaid Bills, Europe and the Confrontation with the Shadows of its Past, which deals exactly with a lot of crisis regions in Europe and what these crises have to do with their past. So we are jumping into the topic we are talking about this afternoon anyway. And the title for the second panel, which I am now going to run, is called Developing New Perspectives for a Common Europe Within and Beyond the European Union. Well, as we journalists like to put things bluntly and shortly, let's say we're talking about the future of Europe and the problems Europe faces on its way towards that future. And the first of our speakers for this afternoon is Professor Ivan Vejvoda, which you probably all know. He's the former vice president of the German Marshall Fund and permanent fellow at the IWM in Vienna, which is, I would call, one of the most renowned think tanks concerning the region of Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. Vejvoda, Professor Vejvoda, of course, himself comes from the Balkans. He's Serbian. He has been engaged in the Yugoslav opposition many years ago as a close advisor to Prime Minister Zoran Djindjic, which we all remember being brutally killed in 2003. And, well, Professor Vejvoda is, of course, one of the leading experts concerning this space of Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And of course, he's dealing with European politics in that sphere. And that's what he's going to talk about today in a, I would say, rather fundamental concept, because what Mr. Vejvoda was going to do this afternoon, he's going to take us back to the age of enlightenment and, well, building a bridge from there to Europe today and its path into the future. So what can we take from that age of enlightenment from the 17th and 18th century to today? What are the ideas that we can follow, which we can still get a hold of to form this new Europe? And so before I start talking too much about it, let me pass over to Professor Vejvoda. I hope you can hear me, and let's listen to your first contribution to this afternoon.
Thank you very much. First of all, I look forward very much to reading your book when it comes out. And thank you for your kind words. And thank you to the organizers and Professor Busek and Dr. Emil Brix for the invitation to be part of this event. Regretfully, we're not together in Favoritenstrasse, but so we'll have to do best with our Zoom screens. I will try to be brief and hopefully not overrun the 5-minute limit by more than a minute or two. I hope you will have some understanding for that. I listened to the first panel with great interest. I think there are a lot of these things that unfortunately, we didn't learn at school or that are still not being taught about these interconnections, of course, of which many of us are aware of. I'd just like to add one that, the link between the Ottoman Empire and Dubrovnik was extremely important. The Republic of Dubrovnik, the trade route that went through the Sanjak, or what we call the Sanjak region today, Novi Pazar, that is in Serbia, and many of the way stations along that route, just an addition to the many important things that were said. So the links are humongous, and in fact, what we call, in maybe too simple language, the renationalization of politics that we have been seeing since the financial crisis and since the migration crisis is obscuring, in fact, the level of links that we have among each other. Um, I'd like to start off with a definition of Europe that I find one of the most compelling, and it comes from, unfortunately, the late George Steiner, literary critic, literary theorist, who wrote an essay, The Idea of Europe. And the definition is extremely simple. He said, draw the coffee house map and you have one of the essential markers of the idea of Europe. And then a little more elaborately, Europe is made up of coffee houses, of café. These extend from Pessoa's favorite cafe house in Lisbon to the Odessa cafes haunted by Isaac Babel's gangsters. They stretch from the Copenhagen cafes, which Kierkegaard passed on his concentrated walks to the counters of Palermo. So I think, again, this idea of Europe, or what I think we're trying to do here, has so many levels. And again, so many of them were addressed in the previous panel. But there is this culture, and unfortunately, the virus has been impeding us to spend more time in our favorite European place called the cafe, because of the situation that we're in. When I was asked to give a presentation here today, the Enlightenment is something, the Aufklärung is something that is extremely important for me. And it's interesting that Professor Attila Pock mentioned Professor Wolff's sort of denying, or rather saying that the Enlightenment divided Europe into a West and East. I don't agree with that. Because if I take my country, which was Yugoslavia but is Serbia today, many of the intellectuals and scholars of the day went from Belgrade, say, or Novi Sad to Western capitals. Famously, Dositej Obradović at the end of the 18th century went to London. We have a translation in Serbia of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America in 1873. Just to mention those things. So if we are to speak in those terms, the Western world, or if you want, the European world, spans these borders. It was eminently demonstrated through the previous presentations of trade and but cultural interlinkages, intellectual interlinkages, university linkages are equally important. The Enlightenment was an awakening to the fact of the humanity of human beings and the need to codify that through rights and rules. Whether it's Montesquieu with the spirit of the laws, or whether it's the Scottish Enlightenment of Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, or the German Enlightenment and the Italian Enlightenment, of course. And the reason was simple, that there was a need to, and of course, I think as Professor Todorovic was mentioning, the Renaissance, the root is the Renaissance. And basically the Enlightenment is a continuation of the Renaissance. And it's putting the individual on the forefront of the stage of history. And I think that's the true European idea, where the European, without any transcendental power above her, is able to define its own or her own future, and to define the ways in which life in community is organized and made possible. Transcendental meaning beyond religion, beyond kind of monarchic links to religion, and the fact that we are all equal, simply liberté, égalité, fraternité. And thus the modern democratic revolutions that came out of that, whether it's the American, the French, the Dutch, or the British, is extremely important. And my deep belief is that we are still standing on that foundation. No matter what the storms and the hurricanes of history have been, and the attempts to divide us and to go back to a sovereignist, nationalist view, which unfortunately has risen its head over the past years again. Whether we call it populism or kind of neo-fascism or whatever you want to call it, this, I think, totally illusionary belief that in European countries, if we turn to ourselves and to turn to ourselves within our borders, somehow we will be better off than extending our hand to our neighbor and to the others. This is, of course, not to say that Europe has huge problems and that Brussels is a dysfunctional place in many ways. But I think what the pandemic crisis has shown is that, in fact, that only by working together with all these stumbling blocks, the kind of Stolpersteine of history, of the Holocaust before, but the stumbling blocks of reacting to something that was completely unforeseen, although we know that pandemics come every now and then, that we have to find ways at best, to come together, or in the European way of muddling through this. And thus, the fact that the thinkers of the Enlightenment, of the encyclopédie, of the Voltaires of this world, had in fact an understanding that you have to put your finger to your head. How is it that we address these questions? And out of that movement came the two great strands of political thinking. And I'm a political scientist, and I apologize for that, and study political philosophy. That's out of that came the two strands of liberalism and socialism. And we know basically how that evolved. But it is no mere simple illusion that many are returning to various of those thoughts, whether they're liberal or socialist, whether it's Marx or Benjamin Constant or others, to look, and they find, in fact, ideas that are still relevant today, not the whole corpus of thinking of certain individuals. So I think that to put it all too crudely, that going back to old stuffy dusted books is not such a bad idea, not only to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but also to, of course, ancient philosophy and history. And I think it gives us pause to understand that many of the problems that we have, no matter what the manifestations in present day world are extremely important. And I will finish this all too brief and all too we used to say telegraphic presentation, but I guess we have to say Twitter-like presentation, by saying the following: the world is really going towards a kind of G2, where the US and China seem to be rising in their own different ways. And there is a danger if we Europeans do not understand the goal of coming together, of which this conference is an important initiative in how we go about doing that while maintaining our diversity. And as Erhard Busek so rightly put, there is, he used this lovely German English word, richdom, which means the wealth that we have in the diversity. We will not be able to confront the threats that are coming from the two sides, left and right, if we look geographically at China and the US. And so I think that efforts like these have to be multiplied, but they have to be, and this is the conclusion, that there must be ways that education, civic education, historical education, has to permeate much more the systems that we have in our countries, because without that, there is a desert on which the various QAnon and other conspiracy theories that subsist through the social media world take root more strongly than, in fact, what is the more important part of an education. Thank you very much, and I apologize for speaking too long.
Thank you, Professor Weber. Thank you for reminding us all of these coffee houses from Vienna to Belgrade. But as we all know, in all these coffee houses, we serve everything from Greek, Serb, Macedonian, Turkish, Croatian, or whatever coffee, which shows us, which shows us that there is something of a national identity, at least in these coffee houses. And I think we're going to be talking about later about this idea, how much national identity we will need in the common Europe. But for now, let's just pass over to the second speaker, which is Stephanie Wöhn, which is from the PFI, the University of Applied Sciences in Vienna, political scientist, holder of the Jean Monnet Chair of the European Union. And Professor Wöhl's field of science is, of course, European integration and the difficulties on that way to European integration. And I think that's exactly what she's going to be talking about right now. So let me just pass over to Professor Wöhl, and you have the word.
Yes, thank you also on my side for the invitation to take part in this conference. Unfortunately, we're all not present, but virtually at least we are. Also to Professor Buzik and Professor Briggs for inviting me. Yes, I was asked also by Sylvia Najwan, thank you at this point, to talk a bit more about the concept of diversity and what is needed actually at this stage in time in global pandemics and global crises, or post-crises, you might say, how we can sort of further this concept of diversity. And maybe I will start with briefly just saying that, of course, if we think of diversity not only in European integration terms, but also as a concept which actually includes diversity of age, of health status, of social status, and differences of ethnic background and gender, for example, disability. Then we have all these differences, of course, which now also in the global pandemic play a major role if we think about health, for example, but also the social differences, employment status, people losing their jobs, etc. So maybe this concept of diversity would need to include actually all of these dimensions that we think of in different member states or states which are in the transition or accession process towards the European Union, that we have a more let's say, balanced stance on these aspects. But also, if we think of the United Nations Global Compact or Global Sustainable Development Goals, also now, we have this big framework actually nowadays that we all can adhere to. And so let me just pick out some of the points which I think, and Professor Veyenada already mentioned it just in his talk a bit, so we might have a little bit similarity what we are focusing on. Because in my research, and I just want to bring to you maybe also the book, maybe I can hold it into camera, The State of the European Union, Fault Lines in European Integration, which I edited with some colleagues last year already, 2020 it came out. We looked at the fault lines in European integration, which means actually what are actually the problems we face now beyond all those well-known like Brexit, the disintegration processes we have at the moment, but also problems of democratic governance, of populism between member states or within member states, yes, rising forms of nationalism, etc., and also different strategies to cope with the manifold crises we've experienced in the past. Think of the financial and economic crisis. There are still member states, but also other states within Europe trying to cope with these crises, and especially the population trying to cope with these crises. And also in face of the global pandemic, there's of course also maybe a dissatisfaction which rose by the people of Europe or different citizens in Greece, if we think of the 2015 referendum against the so-called Troika and the financial policies installed, yes? So we have all these divergences between member states also, but also between the polity, the supranational level of the European Union and the people living in those different member states. So how do we actually come to a closer or a more social integration for the better, especially in times of a global pandemic where we actually have to for the first and foremost now look after our health, actually, and of older people and the elderly who need care, for example, in caring homes, but also all the problems that arise with closed borders between member states. Here, even in Austria, we had the problem that we didn't have enough people who took care of elderly people in long-time care systems, for example. Yes. So all these problems are really pressing at the moment, and they sort of like further the picture of crisis, of manifold crises that we're actually facing in the European Union. So that's why we developed this concept of fault lines in European integration, because actually what we actually need in this time of financial turmoil, of extremism, actually, of differing views on asylum policies, yes, we actually would need common standards that we can at least agree on regarding budget deficits, for example, which has been a big topic if you think of the fiscal compact treaty on the supranational level and other things. So actually here, what I would like to stress is that actually we need also the people of the European Union, the citizens, to be more engaged, more strongly, to be able to express their views. And I would even go so far to go further than what we have since the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, where we can have referendum by the population, right? But I think we would even need to strengthen the European Parliament even more at these times, where we also have questions of unity in voting on questions of reverse majority rule, if you know what I'm talking about the European Commission and the proposals of laws also within the European Council, etc. So these are all the problems we are actually tackling and facing today at this very point in crisis. So that's why I think we would need a strategy actually to overcome and to talk about different interests maybe also at this point of time. Yes, because of course there are very obvious different interests by different member states, by different accession states, and that we need a common endeavor. And Professor Valladolid already mentioned it. Maybe we need to look back in history also to find a common goal for the future, because these problems are so pressing still today, yes, and that these conflicting interests, going from financial problems, going from tax revenues, etc., to the very health of our very populations are so pressing that we need actually maybe new concepts to think about diversity in this context also. Yes. Thank you very much. Maybe, I hope I didn't go over my time that much. Yes, I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting discussion. What I would like to ask you right now is, we all know the difference sociologists today make between the everywheres in Europe and the somewheres. And the everywheres is what seemingly a bit arrogant, we all are sitting together here, don't have a problem with Europe because they feel at home from Belgrade to Lisbon. But those somewheres, and that's the one Stefanie Röhl has been talking about, have an identity which obviously doesn't fit into European identity, which sometimes is very contradictory European identity. So the question we, I think, have to talk about urgently, not only in this plenum here, but in Europe as well, is in general, is what are we going to do with these people and how to give them a European identity without giving them the feeling to lose their identity they have been having up to now, which is a nationalist and a national identity. So that's the question I'd like to, well, if you want to give a short comment about that now, Professor Röhl, maybe.
So already now? It's a good question. I have no real answer to that. I wouldn't say that it's I don't think it's only a problem of identity, actually. I think it's a problem of different interests. That's why, the term interest is so at the forefront of political sciences. I'm sorry, I'm a political scientist, so I always talk about interests. I think, there are common demeanors even between very different cultures, because there are the same problems. Take the global pandemic at the moment. People have the same problems, even though, of course, they are very different in different settings concerning health status, access to health care, for example, or hospitals, for example. Even if you think of all the privatization which has been done in Spain, even, and all the private clinics which were closed down, or people left and didn't care for elderly people anymore, so the people died. I mean, these are problems not only non-EU member states have. So I think it's more, my point was more to say that we need to look at these global processes of global leadership. I mean, think of the United States at the moment, yes, and how we can actually solve those problems also, that we have, I mean, more social cohesion, that we go to more social integration, which I think would be the basis actually to also achieve this more common identity in the long run, actually.
Okay, so you think the first step might be social cohesion and the second step might be identity. Interesting perspective. I would just put it the other way around, but still, it's another question that comes up that we should discuss is like, how much identity do we need to find a new social cohesion in Europe? So how different can we be still feeling together and feeling solidarity among each other? So that's the main question. But so just that, put that to the discussion at the end. I think it's going to be really interesting. And now continue with something more practical. Moving on further south to Istanbul, to Elif Kamisli, which is an exhibition manager, as far as I would say, exhibition maker. And a political scientist as well. And what I read and found really interesting as well as psychoanalysis. So you've been studying political scientists as well as psychoanalysis, which is an interesting combination if we look at the state of Europe today and the problems, which have a lot to do with psychology, I would say. She has been contributing to several international art exhibitions from the Biennale in Venice to the Biennale in Istanbul. And what she's trying to tell us today, I think, is about her new project in Istanbul at the Biennale. And probably what she could show us is this international face of a multicultural metropolis like Istanbul is, and the European face this city certainly has. So pass the word on to Istanbul and to Elif Kamisli.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. So I think my presentation will be slightly different from the others. And yes, it's correct that I've studied political science in my university studies. And then I had my master's degrees on psychoanalysis, but I always worked in art, and it became my professional field. But I believe that I do benefit a lot from both backgrounds that I had during these years, that I had a chance to build many different collaborations with artists and to contribute in very large-scale projects such as the Istanbul Biennial. And so today, considering our subject matter, I want to introduce you actually the biennial, what we do there, and how it is relating to these matters of like creating a common understanding and a common future in Europe. While I'm making my presentation, I would like to share with you a slideshow, which will, while I'm talking, you'll be able to see some images from the Istanbul Biennial, different works. I don't know if you had a chance to visit the Biennial in the past, but I think it would give you a brief understanding of in which scale we work. So I believe everyone sees my desktop now. So I will take it in the presentation mode. Okay, it should start automatically now. So first of all, I would like to thank Hungarian Cultural Institute in Istanbul for their kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today and share the critical role that Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts and the Istanbul Biennial take towards a continuous international dialogue between Europe and Turkey. I hope my brief talk will investigate our subject matter from a different perspective. There are moments in the history that politics may have uneasy directions. However, we strongly believe that the unique language of art and culture functions beyond borders and generates a common understanding and hope. Our past experiences in the continent reflect the significance of dialogue for building peaceful societies. In this context, artists and art operators become protagonists of a possible better future. Istanbul Biennial was established by Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts in 1987, and since its inception, the biennial has been the driving force of contemporary art and culture in the city and in the region. Its efforts have been instrumental to the growth of new artistic and cultural platforms in Turkey and Middle East, and have provided a particular space for international collaborations. Through the 16 preceding biennials, a variety of different artists from Turkey, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas have had the opportunity to develop new artworks, test ideas, and experiment social and aesthetic possibilities concerning the vision of each successive curator or curatorial team. Istanbul Biennial embraced the curatorial model since its fourth edition in 1995, and since then, it has been developing exhibitions together with international curators. These collaborations always provided a singular experience to all parties involved in the biennials, including artists, thinkers, and the audience. The team, who makes the exhibition happen, works diligently to develop further existing international connections to strengthen the artistic exchange. In this respect, I'm proud to say that we were able to present more than 1,000 European artists in the Istanbul Biennials, thanks to the generous support of cultural institutions and individuals from Europe. These artists were invited to Istanbul to produce new artworks, and each individual journey provided a profound look at the historical and current cultural texture of Turkey and resulted with singular contributions in the art history. As a distinctive arts event, the biennial attracts a wide range of audiences, and the opening events are visited by approximately 3,000 curators, press, museum directors, and other art professionals from around the world. And every 2 years, Istanbul Biennial becomes a meeting point that invites more than 500,000 visitors to be a part of an urgent discussion, a contemplation. Its public and educational programs encourages its participants to talk and to build a dialogue. All the activities organized around the biennial creates physical and mental spaces where people can gather and share a common point towards the issues explored in the biennial. For the Istanbul Biennial, as well as all the other festivals organized by the Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, it is utmost important to maintain and extend our international collaborations in each and every edition. Therefore, we prioritize to realize common projects with foreign cultural offices functioning in Turkey. Recently, we were proud to be in the management team of the Be Mobile Create Together project, together with the Institut Français Turkey, the Embassy of Netherlands, and the Goethe Institute. The project aimed to promote artistic and cultural exchanges between Europe and Turkey through the establishment of a multinational and multidisciplinary network of artist residencies. 30 artists had the opportunity to have midterm residencies in 16 different spaces located in Germany, France, Holland, and Turkey, and their works, which were developed during the project, were documented in a publication. It would be important to highlight that with all its means, Mobile Create Together reinforced the ties between art scenes in Turkey and Europe. Lastly, I would like to share with you an intriguing news. I would like to share with you an intriguing news. We are starting a new project titled Cultures Week, supported by the European Union and led by the Goethe Institute in Istanbul. And through this project, we will be supporting artists and cultural institutions, initiatives, and individuals for the next 3 years and a half, which will create a very fundamental base for cultural exchange and also artistic production. We very much hope that a variety of these connections happening through the activities of the Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts and the Istanbul Biennial will continue to inspire others for always finding new ways to develop a common understanding. So that will be my brief presentation.
Thank you, and let's hope art is maybe a way to building new bridges between Europe and Turkey, because a lot of those bridges have been shattered and ramshackled in the recent years by both sides, I would say. But still, maybe art might be a way to overcome some of these. But let's move on to Budapest and from arts to architecture, which is the next speaker is going to be Esa Davida from the Aspen Institute, of course, the Budapest Institute of the Aspen Institute. She's an architect, but as well an urbanist and a scientist of regions and cities, regional studies. And as far as I understand, you have been running a project called Interreg, which is dealing with cities, towns, and regions along the Danube River, passing through, as we all know, several European countries, and in a way looking for common identities along and in these towns and cities, especially with those cities that are along the borders. So when the Danube runs along European borders, there are cities which are split in two by these borders, and if the Danube probably is a way to cross these borders and to find common identities. So from my personal experience, it's a fantastic idea. I do remember my visits to Komarno, which is Komoron in Hungarian, which is a city where we've seen both frightening explosions of nationalism in recent years, referring to the deepest conflicts of the 19th century, but on the other hand, a beautiful way of living together day by day, where all these weird nationalist ideas that politicians bring there don't seem to play a role. But I don't want to talk about that too much because that's your topic, which I think is beautiful. So I pass on to Eszter to Budapest to tell us about this travels along the Danube River and the scientific excavations you've made on these travels, during these travels. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I also prepared a short presentation, so I will just share my screen. I hope to see it. Please confirm. Okay, so I was asked to talk to you about a very big project, which is a Danube project. It's an Interreg project. And I will give you some reflections about our work related to cultural collaborations. I'm an architect, but I'm working with participatory processes for more than 10 years. And I think it's related to all the speakers who were before me. So just to, sorry, I will just remove this thing. So just to have an idea of this project, we had more than 30 partners from all over Europe, and it ran for 2.5 years. And actually, we won this next project, Danube Plus. So we will continue this work. I'm very happy to be here because we may have the chance to cooperate with somebody from now on. Basically, we're also researching build and cultural heritage, tangible and intangible heritage around the Danube. I won't have the time to talk about this, but Fischtuch is a very good example because from Turkey to Germany, all of the nation has something to do with it. And this is a very good example, for example, to an intangible heritage element. We were researching peripheral and small towns and twin towns, which was described before. There are many cities in a very special situation because they are divided by a border. Our vision is actually that if we connect those people around the Danube with a common brand, with a promenade, they can work better, they can contribute better to tourism, culture, to the EU ideas. So it has a lot to do with regional identity, and we think that one of our tools is to let's say, get people together are within culture and the tools within culture. So just to have an idea of the framework of this project, I'm sorry, I don't know how to hide this one. Oh, yeah. So we began to build a network. Actually, Mr. Hanus was also part of this this project with this university. We made a lot of spatial research with architect students in universities. We made a lot of events, tools, and the strategy. But today I will just talk about the events we made. So I was leading implementation processes with local activators. So these are the towns from Romania to Germany where we made any kind of implementation with local cultural institutes. Actually, it was more than 70 events, which is quite a big number if we consider these EU projects. And our basic idea was not only to bring examples from Western Europe or from Europe, but also build on the local resources. And it's very important because it's a big mistake most of the time when it comes to implementation. So this is what we worked a lot, how to find the good connection and how to implement these methodologies into the local context. And this is one of my examples because I think Danube Days, which might be familiar for many of you, is a very good culture channel to connect people. And there was discussion about the regional identity questions. And I think, for example, in a situation like a twin town between Hungary and Slovakia, like Esztergom-Sturovo, this was the first event which we generated, which was directed by the two municipalities for the first time ever. And the same thing happened, for example, within Calafat, which is Bulgaria, Romania, that because of Danube Days, we involved the local institutes, the cultural institutes, and this was the first cultural event they ever made. So, and as I found it, referring back to this identity question, I think if we can find a common point, then this is how we can strengthen this common identity, meanwhile maintaining the national identity parallel. Obviously, we have some other, let's say, results. For example, we made a traveling exhibition which traveled through 6 countries, and we faced many problems like language issues or actually the historical education is different in these countries. So it's also a starting point where we have to start. But again, I can say that finding the common point made us possible to make actually an exhibition like this in all the languages. We also made some booklets to help local institutes. But I want to give you some more. Just some short reflections about what we learned from these 2.5 years. So about mapping and reaching for local activators, one of the main lessons we learned is that they have the potential. We just thought that they need help to reconnect them in new ways, and just giving them some tools how to reconnect them in new ways gave them a potential to work better together and organize themselves into a local network. Another thing we learned is that the non-standard education tools are very rare in this area. So this is why we try to implement good practices related to this topic. And actually, in this new project we are running now, we are focusing more on these educational tools. By education, I mean every kind of knowledge transfer, not just for kids, but also for adults and families and so on. The topic of these events were always a kind of cultural issue between these think tanks. The third thing is participatory processes. We found it very easy to organize these people together, and again, in most of the time, the question was how to reconnect the local sources in a new way. And what we try to always focus on to reconnect not only the local activators, but also the decision makers. So in these pictures, you can see a mayor who was participating in this building camp, and we could renovate the local school in a very small town by the force of students and so on. And this last one is the fostering cultural participation between people from different cultural backgrounds. In this picture, you can see people from Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. Again, we had this experience that cross-border collaboration are very, very tough to do, but at the same time, after people understand the point that we are sharing, we have a lot of common heritage and common cultural elements to share. When they realize this point, then they can identify themselves with those visions. So after this point, they could cooperate together very easily. So these are just the main points I'm wanting to show you, and I hope that we will have a chance to work with some of you in the future. And I will just stop this. Sorry. Screen. Oh, I'm sorry. Stop share. Okay.
Okay. Esther, let me just follow right up with a question about your work. Obviously, you've been traveling rather poor, very often, old and towns and cities being left behind by their own countries and even more by Europe. So, is there any sort of European identity you found among people in these towns and cities? Do they have an idea of Europe and what it means for them, even in their everyday plight, full of problems, feeling forgotten by their own capitals, as we all know, and well, just a hard life from day to day? So, is there any European idea among maybe young people in those cities?
Oh, that's a very hard question, and I must relate to Stephanie well in this, because I also feel that thinking about European standards is very hard. But so I would say that at least according to our experience, they don't really identify those standards with European standards. So I think those standards exist. It's just sometimes we need to raise awareness that these are the common elements we have. So what we did basically, we during participatory workshops between different groups of people, mostly from different nations, we help them to find these common values. And actually, many values of these exist, and I really don't want to. It's really equal to EU, and in the end, every cultural event, for example, people wanted to be together, people wanted to be proud of their cultural heritage, people wanted to show their cultural heritage to each other. So the basics of these events were the same, even though the language was different. But I totally agree that talking about EU and talking about European standards is something very crucial right now, because sometimes the average knowledge about these standards, I think, is just is very different in each of these countries.
But do the people even feel that Europe has a place for them inside Europe? So Europe just looks at them, or do they feel forgotten by that? Europe, they are sometimes part of, like the Slovaks and the Hungarians and the Romanians, of course, or like, because we're talking about parts of Europe, parts of the European Union, but sometimes, to my personal experience, people just don't feel part of the European Union. They feel they get some money from somewhere, which is a far away city called Brussels, but they don't feel too European.
I have a short question to that, a short answer to that. Our experience was that when we could establish intercultural events, they began to feel it. But so actually, I think this kind of event gives the people a little bit vision about how could the system work. Because when we connected, for example, a community from Hungary with a community in Bulgaria or a community in Romania who had a very similar situation because of this territory situation on the Danube, they began to understand each other, but they needed us as a meeting point to connect them. So this is what we are working on. We have some very two or three but good examples of this kind of regional network, interregional network, but it's very hard to find, at least for us. But this is what we are working on. So my short answer is that yes, but it's a hard work to do.
Professor Weber, let's try to put this European idea, give it a more fundamental perspective. You've been talking about liberalism and socialism as, of course, the outcome of enlightenment. Well, what comes to my mind spontaneously is like that nationalism of the 19th century has far more deeply entrenched itself in the identity of countries in Europe, specifically in the Balkans, as we all know, with its chaotic past in the 19th century. So why is it that this ideas of liberalism, socialism have become so blurred, so forgotten sometimes, whereas nationalism, as we all know, is still so deeply entrenched in all these countries, and these borders are felt everywhere you go.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Of course, in the 19th century, nationalism was a progressive idea. The various Garibaldis and the unification of Italy, of Germany. This was a liberation from other forces, whether it was imperial forces. In the Balkans, nations were created before states. And that is one of the problems. The German sociologist Helmut Plessner wrote this book called Verspätete Nationen, Belated Nations, talking about this putting the wrong foot forward historically. Serbs and Croats were there before Serbia and Croatia or Yugoslavia, just to take a point. I think there's an additional element that we need to be aware of, and that there is, to put it very simply, the phenomenon of rallying around the flag of a nation coming together in difficult times, whether it's war, whether it's a catastrophe. And we saw that in the worst possible way in the breakdown of my country where I was born, Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist today anymore, when politicians in the 6 units of Yugoslavia called republics, to preserve power, so they were engaged in a power preservation strategy, they used the easiest tool to rally the people, and that was nationalism, saying, we Croats are endangered by Serbs, let's stick together. And vice versa, Milosevic said, we Serbs stick together because all of the others are against us. And that is why it goes back to someone in the first panel, I can't remember exactly who it was, about the responsibility of leadership. Of course, global leadership in the world, but also what is leadership used for? Is it used for staying in power and making money? And I won't mention any names here. No need to. We all know, who's in that kind of game. And politics is very often about power and money. But there's also what the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur said, the rational, the good side of politics, not only the evil, and that is to lead your nation, to put it grandly, towards higher goals. As Michelle Obama said, some of us go high when others go low. And I think that many leaders are going low today, and we are sort of lacking that visionary leadership. And to quote Helmut Schmidt, I don't like that quote, but he said, anyone who has a vision should go see an eye doctor. But I think we do need someone who projects, and whatever we think of Chancellor Merkel or President Macron, they have diverse visions. And I think that what Chancellor Merkel did in 2015 with the migration crisis was a grand and positive decision, an extremely difficult one, given the circumstances. But I think, as we all know, migrations have created the planet that we live on. You know, when that person from the African Valley of Omo started walking somewhere, you know, towards Asia or Europe, that was the beginning of civilization. So the movement of people is an essential element in the survival of us all. Now, not to remain at that very general level that may be also banal to quote, I think that you know what if I may relate to what Esther just said, it's really about people understanding that they have common problems and common challenges. When I was at the German Marshall Fund, we had a program that was financed by the German foundation Mercator to have European parliamentarians, not parliamentarians sitting in Brussels, but members of the Parliament of Estonia, of Greece, of Italy, of Portugal, come together in a group of 40. And it is incredible. It's exactly as Esther said. Suddenly they discover that, you know, they're the same people, they have the same problems, bread and butter problems, and that there are ways to cooperate. We need to bring people together for them to see that they are not, you know, black and white or different, or because they are Estonian and Greek, that they are two worlds apart. No, it is the same world. The problem is that in this case of European parliamentarians in their national parliaments, to get into power, they have to deal with bread and butter issues and whether, you know, there's a factory opening and closing. They don't have time to think about bigger European issues. And that is why it's fortunate that we have the imperfect European Union that we have and its leaders. And leaders, of course, when they go back home, many of them historically, and Britain is a case in point, go back home and do what we call Brussels bashing, criticizing Brussels for everything that's wrong because, my goodness, our government is perfect, and it's because Brussels is saying this that we have to do things that they are. So that there is a, to put it mildly, a hypocrisy that is going on here, because they don't acknowledge, and this is what leadership should be about, of these leaders explaining to their people, yes, Brussels is imperfect, but if we didn't have Brussels, we wouldn't be where we are today in terms of the wealth that we have created.
As you said, we're talking about common problems and common challenges. So, Stephanie Wöhl, why is it so easy to find individual nationalist answers to these common problems and common challenges? And why does it seem so hard just to speak out that there are European answers to these European problems? Why does it seem to be so hard for all these politicians? Why do they act like Professor Wiewoda actually said? What's the reason for it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree with Professor Yoda, because I think, of course, it's the age of populism again at the moment that we see, right? And of course, it's always easier to cope with a specific problem and to give simple answers to a broad range of questions. And I think the projects that you both, Elif and Esther, showed so well that we have so much common and diverse, actually, if it is in art or if it is in common projects around or along the Danube. Because you always see that when people get together, they get to know their living and their working conditions. And we also experience this now in the pandemic. Of course, there are people who are saying, okay, this virus does not exist, and they are demonstrating against it. And of course, they are very prone to very populist reasoning in this context. And I think it's the same on the identity question. I mean, identity is a complex is a complex phenomenon and has always been contested. Think of Sheila Ben-Habib, who has done research on this, but also Hannah Arendt, who talks about the rights of others. Yes, what are the rights of others coming into our countries on migration and asylum, for example? And of course, that's why I stress so much the factor of social cohesion and integration, because as we can see also now, people have common problems. They are they're getting unemployed, yes, and of course they want quick answers sometimes, and sometimes they adhere to quick answers to that, but these answers are complex. You can't answer them easily because there's different interests by different interests and lobby groups maybe also in play, and maybe politicians too easily sometimes also adhere to very simple answers to these complex questions. And I think, but to make it simple actually would be even better. We have seen, just to give you an example, a lot of meat producing companies now had a high number of coronaviruses. So for the first time, we actually explored what problems these companies have in producing, what working conditions they have, how their employees work actually. And we see this in different countries across the EU, and maybe also other countries, not yet part of the EU. So actually, we do have these commonalities, and they have a lot to do with how we produce. Even the pandemic has a lot to do with how we produce, how export producing zones in China work nowadays, and how we go deeper to exploit the natural habitat of people, right? So how does populism work? I mean, there are a lot of people who've given a lot of answers to that. And I think it's the thing of, in the era of fake news, it's so much more easy to click on a social media button and agree or disagree with something than really relating to complex problems that we can only solve together and by education, right? I mean, that's one of the main parts.
Obviously, do you think art is a way of finding a new European identity? Can art cross bridges, build new bridges in times where these bridges are all broken down by nationalism? So especially Istanbul as the European face of Turkey, a country which seems to be enemy to everybody, especially to my home country, which is a weird idea after centuries of close cooperation. But still, so like the question is, can art and the art you making and the art the Biennale is making can cross these gaps and bridges, build bridges?
Mhm. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think first we should all admit that we are functioning in very difficult times. Um, I mean, from the perspective of political scientists or academicians, you have other problematics that are recurring from the past century. But from our point of view as cultural operators who are trying to bring a different view to this complex world, the life is getting much more complicated due to all these, nationalistic movements and hot politics in the region, and of course scarcity of the resources, because art and culture is never a priority for a governmental perspective, let's say. So, I mean, of course, there are hundreds of biennials all around the world. And if you think that, why we have all these biennials and how they can contribute to build a peaceful society or a common Europe or a different understanding of living together, there are many different sublines. I mean, especially the third generation of the biennials, starting with the cultural marketing of a city, they position themselves in a different space. However, Istanbul, established in 1987, from the beginning, which is called now Old Generation, had a huge statement saying that we will do something like beyond the problematic features of the politicians and the borders. We will try to build a common language. And on that sense, I find myself very lucky to be able to work in this structure because, as you said, Istanbul has been a cosmopolitan city from centuries. And I mean, this is one of the most ancient cities that you can find. And you can still feel all the traces of these multinational groups who had lived here throughout the time. And as let's say the organizers of the biennial, one of our main goal is like the keeping the remembrance of that rich cultural heritage and the history. So I mean, of course, like the biennials all have different perspective and concepts, but if you look at our shows, you will see that always we pick a very vital subject for the current discussions all around the world. And mostly, I mean, of course, these are all artistic and cultural events, but they have their own political statements. I mean, art gives you the possibility to talk about things that you cannot normally talk, or you cannot directly talk. It has its own way of approaching very delicate issues that could cause many diplomatic problems, maybe between different groups. And you know, through that abstract and poetic language, you are able to open up a very delicate discussion in a highly, let's say, stress society to talk about something. So, on that sense, I feel like, yes, I think art and culture has a very, very vital role in these very brutal times that we are all passing through. And as an international art organization and event, of course, we are closely in contact with our colleagues in Europe, and we are constantly sharing our experiences and how we are challenged by the current problems. And of course, like COVID-19 is a, you know, one of the major issues now that everybody is discussing, because I'm sure you are all following through some news channels that, yeah, people who work in the art and cultural field, and especially the producers, artists, are in serious, let's say, difficulty due to all these problems. But it's true, Turkey has and always has been a very, like, a kind of up and down relationship with European Union. I mean, during my studies of political science, it was actually the years that Turkey was a very good candidate, and it was improving during the candidateship process. So we were all following with great enthusiasm the next steps. However, in years also we became witness of this regression during the, let's say, membership process. And but what I can say, even, you know, I will not enter the reasons that how this situation was reversed, but I can say that whatever happens during all this process, European Union actually never stopped giving grants, cultural grants to Turkey. Which is very meaningful, because in the end, you know, it's very bureaucratical and a different, let's say, a different way of maybe making things happen. But I believe that, I mean, I've been working in this field for 20 years now, and what I see, many projects between different nations, communities, groups, artists, and disadvantaged groups, refugee communities, they all happened. You know, also thanks to contribution of these grants which were provided from European Union during the membership process. Of course, there are, you know, many other efforts and resources that we build in time, but I think it's important to admit that this has a fundamental role. And on that sense, Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, which is the leading organization of the biennial, which was established in 1970s by a private family. So it's a non-governmental and non-profit organization. It became a kind of a more, let's say, how to formulate. So it's a more reliable and a kind of long-term sustainable institution that could bring different parties together. And of course, like, when you make all these different activities with all these different parties, this requires a good amount of diplomacy and negotiation skills. So art and culture is a vital subject, and, you know, a kind of practice for, I think, our future. But when we say art and culture, it's not just art and culture. It has many different skills and assets behind that bringing together.
Okay. Well, you said that there's sensitive issues, delicate issues only art can address. I'd like to uh, ask Professor Weveler for probably a final thought because you started taking us back to the age of enlightenment. So, isn't it sometimes frightening that in Europe, more than 300 years after the age of enlightenment, how much irrationalism, how many, as Elif Kamisli said it, how many delicate, sensitive issues are still there, how many irrational issues are still there, and we still need to talk about, we still need to discuss 300 years later.
Absolutely. I think there's been a kind of illusion of progressivism or a linear way forward. Our colleague Stefan Wörl mentioned interests. You know, there are this book, I think Michael Walzer or also other authors who talked about the movement from passion to interest, the curbing of passion, the control of passion or irrationality, if you want, and translating it into interests about which we can negotiate in a calm fashion through organized institutions that are there to dampen those passions and that are there to control maybe irrational feelings that can lead to conflict and war. And so basically, the European Union is a response to that. It's a way of moving from passions to interests and creating institutions that are there to cushion those conflicts. You know, I liken it to a high-rise building that has been created to survive severe earthquakes and a building that can shake but not break down. And so up until now, at least, we can't talk about the future. European institutions have been able to survive earthquakes and to shake, but to stay in place. It's getting more difficult with, as you are rightly pointing out, to this question of identity and nationalism. What is it that leads certain leaders and thus nations who follow them in electing them, who think that it's more important to be of a certain nationality and identity than anything else, or from saying we don't want foreigners or people of other color, of other religion? And I think we all know whom we're talking about here. That is very dangerous because, as we said earlier, it is the plurality of the humankind that makes it wealthier. You know, thinking about the Danube, I just was reminded of one of my favorite authors, Elias Canetti, you know, who was born on the Danube in what was Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria, Ruse, who then became a British citizen who lived in Switzerland, and who was one of the many, like George Steiner, whom we mentioned, or Stefan Zweig, another one, who were deeply European, but didn't lose the sense of who they were in terms of identity. And I think that's one of the problems. That's why I believe education is so important. It's not a panacea, but it helps to help young people as they go through the educational process to understand that we have layers of identity. We are whatever gender we are, we are born in a town, in a country. I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore. And I often reading Zweig, I can understand what it meant to lose the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whatever that was. But suddenly you are in a classroom looking at a map of a country, and then that disappears, and you're suddenly living in a different geographical shape than you used to before. It's happened to many others in history, and I do not wish anyone to lose their country. It's not an easy experience to go through. But again, because we are resilient in the way we are, in particular on the European continent, you stand up and carry on. And so I think the way that you have been pushing us to address these questions is extremely important. How much identity do we need before we feel relaxed? And it has to do, and that is why it's important to look at all these aspects, culture, art, psychology, psychoanalysis, political, economic science. Because if people are living a comfortable life, earning a sufficient salary to provide for themselves and their families, to go off for a holiday once or twice a year, then these problems of identity are not there. Once we reach a threatening situation, whether it's a pandemic or in what was called the migration crisis, or a conflict, or a threatening neighbor, then that is very fertile ground for somebody to whip up those emotions. And finally, that is why there's been this whole question about what kind of narrative do we have about Europe. We've all been saying we need a new narrative, and it's been very simplistic. But in fact, and that's where I think we need to go back to the understanding of the emotions. It was Bono, I think, who used that quote about we need more passion and emotions. It's true. There must be a way in which we can talk about Europe more passionately. I think in the way that we have been doing here today, by bringing these different strands together.
Well, well, your idea of standing up and carrying on, that's what we probably all have to do in these times and in the times to come. And I'd like to finish up this conference. I'd like to ask Dr. Balat Sharashi for his closing remarks to this conference. You have the word.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. I guess Professor Vejvoda actually did the closing remarks for me, but I will try to add some more after this wonderful panels with so many wise and interesting words and comments, which was also very interesting and personal for me as a person who was born in Budapest and learned how to kayak and canoe on the Danube, and then later on was also part of activist events to get the city and the river closer together. Actually, this association was also kind of partner of the project which Esther Davida was talking about. And then after that, living here in Istanbul, on the other end of this region, let's say, and I think the most important part where every conversation went out was about where is this region actually. So like a questioning not only our identity, like who we are, but also talking about the identity or identifying the region. Let it be the European Union or Europe or the Danube, which we are constantly actually reframing, I guess, during history and during these past centuries and during these past decades. And about this, it's also an interesting fact that many, I don't know if it is true or not, I'm not a geographist or geologist, but many Istanbul people think that the Danube actually flows through the Black Sea and flows through the Bosphorus. So actually, in the belief of Istanbul people, I am actually sitting right at the end of the Danube in a way which connects us in many ways, as you could see, which are also borders, that it be just imaginary borders or real borders since the Roman Empire, but also and most importantly connections and sharing of knowledge and projects and history and infrastructure which connects, and sharing through art, which is and culture, which is also very important for us as a cultural center. And what was also interesting that everybody was in from different angles. Every people or every participant was coming with ideas of rethinking or projects to rethink or reshape these regions or these imaginary borders or also the cultural heritage. It's for me it's very interesting that how the functions are changing in time, while we are talking about like how the function of the river's sides are changing, and how these objects there, like for example, we were talking about the limes, and we were talking about ports, which are not used as in the same way like earlier, but it still has a different, or becomes a bearer of a different function, like for example tourism, or for example relaxation or sport, and that makes us think always like how many things a river like the Danube or any other river means for people, like just like food and then drinking water already. So basically life in general. It's the water is a symbol of life, as we know, but also shipping and commerce and sport and energy and maybe gold, washing. So many things, and so many things are all around this, and this all has this make this heritage, which we have an approach for, and which is definitely there is a need for changing our approach, as everybody was talking about it and discussing it. And I think this is a very good contribution, and hopefully this is a beginning of a discussion, and we can continue, or at least you can partner up and really or continue the discussions. I'm really sorry on this part that we couldn't make this conference offline, so that you could also meet in person, and we could meet with the audience and their questions in person. So we are very sorry about this, but at least in this form, and later on it will be also reviewable, as far as I know. So this change, I think this is the most important, how we are going to change and how we are going to shape our cultures, European Union, Turkey, just the Danube region, however we call it, or whatever part it is. And I hope that we will build together all these countries, from Turkey until all of Europe, and solving our problems with this by finding these common interests, which we were talking about. So I think I don't want to talk too long, but last but not least, I also have to thank everybody, the participants for their thoughts, the moderators as well for their thoughts and comments and great questions. Of course, great thank you for the IDM and for this cooperation between us, especially personally for Silvia and Ajiwan, who we were preparing and working a lot on this conference, and also the European Union Turkey Intercultural Dialogue Program, which funded this activity, the Yunus Emre Institute, which was our partner in this program. I hope I didn't forget anyone, and also of course, the audience, the most important. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining, and I hope these discussions are going to continue.
Well, thank you to all of you reaching out there from Istanbul to Budapest, and let's hope we see each other next time around one table talking together. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.